What if Pennsylvania's darkest secrets were hiding in plain sight? Welcome to Black Fears. 8 disturbing true horror stories that will shatter everything you thought you knew. Names and details have been altered to protect privacy, but these events are real and absolutely terrifying. From industrial nightmares to cosmic terror, not all of them have answers. Drop a comment telling us where you're watching from and what time it is. Subscribe, hit like, and share this with someone brave enough. Let's begin. My name is Tucker, and I used to be an industrial safety inspector for the state of Pennsylvania. What I witnessed at the Clairton Coke Works in August 2024 ended my career, destroyed my faith in corporate accountability, and left me with questions that still keep me awake at night. I'm telling you this story because someone needs to know the truth about what happened there, even if the official records will never reflect it. I arrived at the Clairton facility on August 14, 2024, for what was supposed to be a routine safety inspection. The Coke Works had been operating since the early 1900s, converting coal into coke for steel production, and I'd inspected the place a dozen times over my 15-year career. The smell was always the same: sulfur, coal dust, and the acrid bite of industrial chemicals. But that morning, as I stepped out of my car in the employee parking lot, I noticed something different. Beneath the familiar odors, there was something else, something sweet and wrong, like fruit rotting in summer heat mixed with copper pennies. I remember pausing by my vehicle, my inspection clipboard pressed against my chest, trying to identify that smell. It made my stomach turn, and I felt an instinctive urge to get back in my car and leave. I should have listened to that instinct. The facility manager, a man I'd worked with before, met me at the main office. He seemed more nervous than usual, his handshake clammy and brief. He rushed through the preliminary paperwork, barely making eye contact, and kept glancing at his phone. When I asked about any recent incidents or maintenance issues, he assured me everything was normal. Standard operations, he said. No accidents, no injuries, nothing unusual to report. But the way he said it, the way his voice cracked slightly on the word unusual, made me suspicious. I've been doing this job long enough to know when someone's hiding something. The inspection began in the older sections of the facility, the massive furnaces where coal was heated to extreme temperatures in the absence of oxygen to produce coke. The heat was overwhelming, even from a distance. Waves of it distorted the air, making everything shimmer and waver. I was checking the gas recovery system, examining the pipes and valves that captured the byproduct gases from the coking process, when I noticed one of the furnace chamber doors was slightly ajar. That wasn't standard procedure. Those doors should be sealed tight during operation, especially when temperatures inside could reach 2,000 degrees Fahrenheit. I called over the shift supervisor, a man named Bentley, who'd been working at the plant for 23 years. He looked at the open door and went pale. Actually pale, the color draining from his face so quickly I thought he might pass out. He told me not to look inside, but I'm an inspector. That's literally my job. I approached the furnace chamber, the heat intensifying with each step. The sweet, rotting smell was stronger here, mixed with something else, something organic and alive. Through the gap in the door, I could see the interior walls of the chamber. What I saw shouldn't have been possible. Growing on the heat-resistant refractory bricks that lined the chamber, there was tissue. Actual biological tissue, fleshy and pulsating, spreading across the surface like some grotesque fungus. It was dark red, almost purple, with veins of metallic silver running through it. The tissue moved, contracting and expanding rhythmically as if it were breathing. The temperature inside that chamber should have incinerated any organic matter instantly, but this thing was thriving. It was feeding on the heat, growing in an environment that should have been absolutely sterile and lifeless. I staggered backward, my mind refusing to process what I'd seen. Bentley grabbed my arm, his fingers digging in hard enough to bruise. He told me we needed to talk somewhere private, away from the other workers. We went to a small office on the second floor of the administrative building. That's when he showed me his hands. The skin on his palms and fingers had a strange sheen to it, like oil on water, reflecting rainbow colors in the fluorescent light. As I watched, horrified, I could see the texture of his skin changing. It wasn't smooth anymore. It looked almost crystalline, like metal was forming just beneath the surface. He told me he'd touched the flesh 3 days earlier during a routine maintenance check. He'd been trying to scrape it off the chamber walls, thinking it was some kind of unusual slag buildup. The moment his glove made contact, he felt a burning sensation, even through the protective material. When he removed his glove back in the locker room, his hand looked normal. But over the next 72 hours, the changes began. Bentley wasn't the only one. He pulled out a folder from a locked drawer in the office desk, his hands shaking so badly he could barely grip the papers. Inside were employee medical records dating back 6 months. 14 workers had reported similar symptoms: metallic skin discoloration, unusual tissue density, joint stiffness, and in the more advanced cases, actual fusion of finger bones. Every single report had been stamped with the same diagnosis: industrial dermatitis. Every single case had been treated with basic topical creams and filed away. No follow-up investigations. No deeper medical examinations. Nothing. I asked Bentley why. He hadn't gone to the hospital. Why none of them had demanded real medical attention. He told me they'd been offered significant bonuses to keep quiet, to accept the company doctor's diagnosis, to continue working their shifts. Most of them had families, mortgages, car payments. They couldn't afford to lose their jobs, and the company knew it. I spent the next 2 hours documenting everything I could. I took photographs of Bentley's hands, close-up shots that clearly showed the metallic transformation. I copied the medical records. I returned to the furnace chamber with a high-temperature camera and captured thermal images of the organic growth. The tissue registered at temperatures that should have killed it instantly, but the thermal signature showed active biological processes, living cells functioning at 2,000 degrees. I collected samples using specialized equipment, sealing them in containment vessels. Every piece of evidence pointed to something that defied everything I knew about biology, chemistry, and physics. I was building an airtight case, documentation that would shut down the facility, trigger federal investigations, and hopefully get these workers the medical treatment they desperately needed. Then I made the mistake of filing my preliminary report. Within an hour of submitting it through the standard channels, my phone rang. It was the corporate legal department for the parent company that owned the Clairton Works. The woman on the other end of the line had a voice like ice. She knew my name, my employee ID number, my home address, and the names of my wife and 2 daughters. She didn't threaten me explicitly. She didn't need to. She simply informed me that my preliminary report had been flagged for additional review due to inconsistencies and unverified claims. She told me that my samples had been collected for independent analysis by company-approved laboratories. She suggested that I might benefit from taking some personal time, perhaps a stress-related leave of absence. She mentioned that several former state inspectors had found lucrative positions in the private sector after their government service ended. The message was crystal clear: back off, accept the compensation, and forget what I'd seen. I wanted to fight. I wanted to go to the media, to federal regulators, to anyone who would listen. But when I went back to my office the next morning, my report was gone from the system, completely wiped. The photographs I'd taken had been deleted from my camera's memory card. The physical copies of the medical records I'd made had vanished from my locked desk drawer. Even the containment vessels with the tissue samples were missing from the secure evidence locker. It was as if my entire inspection had never happened. When I confronted my supervisor, he looked at me with a mixture of pity and warning. He told me that Clairton Coke Works had passed their inspection with no significant violations noted. He handed me a transfer order. Effective immediately, I was being reassigned to a different district, 300 miles away. My family would need to relocate, New house, new schools for my daughters, new life. The alternative was early retirement with reduced benefits. I took the transfer. I'm not proud of it, but I did. I moved my family, tried to forget, tried to convince myself that maybe I'd misinterpreted what I'd seen. Maybe the stress of the job had gotten to me. Maybe there was a rational explanation that I simply didn't understand. But 3 months later, in November 2024, I saw a news report. There had been an industrial accident at the Clairton Coke Works, an explosion in one of the furnace chambers. 7 workers injured, 2 critically. The facility was temporarily shut down for safety reviews. The news anchors talked about aging infrastructure, the need for modernization, the unfortunate reality of working in heavy industry. They didn't mention the flesh. They didn't mention the transformation. They didn't mention the cover-up. I knew the truth, though. The tissue had spread too far, grown too large, consumed too much of the facility's infrastructure. It had finally breached containment, and whatever unholy chemical reaction had created it in the first place had reached a critical mass. Those workers who were injured, I wonder how many of them had the metallic sheen on their skin. I wonder how many of them are still transforming, their bones shifting and fusing beneath tissue that's no longer entirely human. I wonder if the company doctors are still diagnosing it as dermatitis, still offering bonuses for silence, still filing reports that will never be investigated. I still have nightmares about Bentley's hands. I see them in my sleep, the way the metallic surface caught the light, the way his fingers had started to merge at the knuckles. I dream about that pulsating tissue inside the furnace chamber, growing and spreading, feeding on impossible heat. Sometimes in these dreams, I'm back in that facility, and I can feel my own skin starting to change. I look down at my hands and see that rainbow sheen, feel the burning sensation beneath my flesh as something foreign and wrong begins to rewrite my biology at the cellular level. The worst part is knowing that it's still out there. The facility reopened 2 months after the accident. Production resumed. Workers clocked in for their shifts, operating the same equipment, breathing the same air, touching the same surfaces. Whatever experimental chemical catalyst created that living metallic tissue, it's still in the system. The company has buried the evidence, silenced the witnesses, and written off the victims as acceptable losses in the name of profit margins. And I let them do it. I took their transfer, accepted their implicit threat, and walked away. So I'm asking you, whoever is reading this or listening to this story, what would you have done? Would you have fought harder? Would you have risked everything, your career, your family's safety, your life, to expose the truth? Or would you have done exactly what I did, taken the path of least resistance, and tried to live with the guilt? Because I'm living with it every single day, and I don't know if that makes me a coward or just another victim of a system designed to protect power at any cost. What would you have done? My name is Sophia, and I'm a mathematics professor at Penn State University. I specialize in geometric topology and spatial dimensions, fields that most people find abstract and theoretical. I've spent my entire career working with concepts that exist only on paper, in equations that describe realities we can't physically observe. But on October 31st, 2019, I encountered something that turned every assumption I had about dimensional space into a living nightmare. What I experienced in Hellam Township that night shattered the boundaries between theoretical mathematics and physical reality in ways that still leave me questioning which version of myself is writing these words right now. I drove to Hellam Township on Halloween night with a specific purpose. For years, I'd been researching local folklore and urban legends that contained mathematical anomalies, patterns in the stories that suggested something more than simple superstition. The legend of the 7 gates of hell in York County was particularly intriguing. According to the myth, 7 gates existed in the woods near an old asylum site, and if you passed through all 7 gates at midnight, you'd be transported to hell itself. Most people dismissed it as typical horror folklore, teenagers scaring each other with campfire stories. But when I analyzed historical accounts and eyewitness testimonies, I found something unusual. Multiple witnesses, across different decades, described the same geometric impossibility. The first gate appearing to exist in multiple locations simultaneously, depending on the observer's position. I arrived at the site around 10:30 that evening, giving myself enough time to set up my equipment before the supposed witching hour. The woods were dense, the kind of place where flashlight beams seem to get swallowed by darkness after only a few feet. I had brought surveying equipment, laser measurement tools, a high-resolution camera, and a GPS unit programmed to track my exact coordinates. My plan was simple: locate the first gate, document its position using multiple measurement methods, and either confirm it as a fixed structure or prove the spatial anomaly reports were measurement errors or perceptual tricks. I'm a scientist. I believe in observable, repeatable phenomena. I expected to spend a cold night in the woods, gather data that would debunk the legend, and write a paper about how human perception creates false patterns in ambiguous environments. The first gate wasn't hard to find. It stood about 30 yards into the woods, a crude metal archway half covered in rust and overgrown with dead vines. Someone had welded it together decades ago, probably as a property marker or the entrance to something long since demolished. I set up my first measurement station, placing a laser rangefinder on a tripod and taking precise distance readings to the gate from my position. The reading came back as 43.7 feet. I recorded the data, moved 20 feet to my left, and took another measurement from the new position. Basic trigonometry. The distance should have changed predictably based on my movement, but the reading said 43.7 feet again, exactly the same. I checked my equipment, recalibrated, and measured a third time, 43.7 feet. I walked in a complete circle around the gate, taking measurements every 15 degrees. Every single reading was identical, which was mathematically impossible. The gate couldn't maintain a fixed distance from me while I moved. Space doesn't work that way. I switched to visual confirmation, taking photographs from different angles. When I reviewed the images on my camera's display screen, I felt my stomach drop. In the photograph taken from the north side, the gate appeared directly ahead, centered in the frame. In the photograph taken from the south side, 90 degrees different, the gate also appeared directly ahead, centered in the frame. I looked up from the camera to the physical gate standing in front of me, then back at the photographs. The gate existed in multiple spatial positions simultaneously, not appearing to exist in multiple places, actually existing there, the light reflecting off its surface, the physical structure occupying space, all of it present in configurations that violated basic Euclidean geometry. I should have left. Every rational part of my mind was screaming at me to pack up my equipment and get out of those woods. But I'm a mathematician. I've spent years studying theoretical spaces where normal geometric rules don't apply, dimensions beyond the 3 we can perceive, topological structures that seem impossible until you work through the proofs. This was my life's work, manifesting in physical reality. I had to understand it. I had to know how deep the impossibility went. So I did what any obsessed academic would do. I started looking for the other 6 gates. I found the second gate around 11:15, then the third, the fourth, the fifth. Each one exhibited the same spatial anomaly, existing in multiple positions at once, maintaining impossible fixed distances from my observation point. But they weren't just copies or reflections. I could touch each gate, feel the rust flaking off under my fingers, the coldness of the metal. They were physical objects, solid and real, somehow anchored to points in space that shouldn't exist in the same dimensional plane. My GPS unit had stopped functioning properly around the third gate. the coordinates flickering between values that differed by miles, even though I'd only walked a few hundred feet. The numbers on the display started showing impossible values, coordinates that would place me simultaneously in Pennsylvania, and locations that didn't exist on any map. At 11:47, I found what I thought was the sixth gate. But as I approached it, my vision began to fragment. I don't mean blur or double, I mean fragment, like reality was a cracked mirror, and I could see through multiple shards at once. In one fragment, I was walking toward the gate from the north. In another, I was approaching from the east. In a third, I was standing completely still, 20 feet away, not moving at all. All three versions were happening simultaneously. All three were equally real. I could feel my body moving in multiple directions at once. My consciousness split across different spatial positions, experiencing contradictory realities that somehow all existed in the same moment. Then, at exactly 11:47 p.m., the other six gates became visible. They hadn't appeared. They had always been there. I simply hadn't been able to perceive them until that precise temporal moment, as if my consciousness needed to reach a specific state before it could process what was actually present in the space around me. 7 gates, arranged in a perfect heptagonal pattern, each one a point on a geometric figure that existed in more dimensions than I could count. And through each gate, I could see beyond, not hell, not fire and demons and the mythological underworld of religious tradition. I saw mathematics, pure, infinite mathematics, a vast consciousness that existed across every possible permutation of reality, experiencing all timelines and all choices and all outcomes simultaneously. I saw myself, infinite versions of myself. In one, I had turned back at the first gate, driven home, dismissed the measurements as equipment failure. In another, I had never come to Helm Township at all. In a third, I had walked through the first gate and ceased to exist in this dimensional space entirely. In a fourth, I was standing exactly where I was now, observing the same phenomenon, but the equation describing my position had different variables, different constants, a different solution that led to a different version of this moment. Every choice I had ever made, every decision point in my life existed as a separate timeline, and I could perceive all of them at once, not as possibilities or hypotheticals, as actual physical realities occurring in parallel dimensional spaces. The consciousness beyond the gates wasn't malevolent or benevolent. It simply was. It existed as a mathematical absolute, a being that had evolved beyond linear time and singular dimensional existence. It perceived the entire multiverse of branching timelines as a single, unified equation. Every variable, every permutation, every possible outcome visible and present all at once. And in that moment of contact, I understood something terrible. Human consciousness isn't designed to perceive multiple realities simultaneously. We experience time as linear because our minds can only process one version of events at a time. But the gates had broken that limitation. They had forced my consciousness to expand beyond its designed capacity, to see what should remain hidden behind the comfortable illusion of singular reality. I don't remember leaving the woods. I have 3 separate memories of leaving, each one equally vivid. In one memory I ran, stumbling through the darkness, my equipment abandoned behind me. In another, I walked calmly back to my car, methodically packing away my tools as if nothing had happened. In a third memory, I never left. I'm still standing in that heptagonal pattern of gates, watching infinite versions of myself make infinite choices. All 3 memories feel true. All 3 exist in my mind as actual experiences, not dreams or hallucinations. The timeline has split, and I can no longer determine which version I'm living. The drive home exists as 4 different memories. The following morning, 5 different versions, Each day since October 31st, 2019, the number of parallel memories increases. I remember teaching my topology class on November 1st. I also remember calling in sick that day. I remember both, with equal clarity, equal detail, equal certainty that both happened. I remember conversations I had with my department chair that he swears never occurred. I remember events he describes that I have no memory of experiencing. We're talking about the same timeline, but we're perceiving different versions of it. I tried to explain what happened to my colleagues, to other mathematicians who might understand the implications. But how do you describe experiencing multiple realities simultaneously to people who exist in only one? I showed them my photographs from that night, the images that clearly show spatial impossibilities. They see ordinary pictures of a gate in the woods. The impossibility is invisible to them. Or perhaps I'm perceiving something in the images that exists in a different dimensional layer they can't access. I don't know anymore. I can't distinguish between what's shared reality and what's unique to my fragmented perception. The worst part isn't the confusion or the uncertainty about which timeline I occupy. The worst part is knowing that I made every possible choice. In some reality, I never went to Hellam Township. In others, I went but turned back before finding all the gates. In one particularly vivid set of memories, I walked through the seventh gate and experienced something beyond my ability to describe, a space where even the concept of I became meaningless, dissolved into pure mathematical relationship without a subject to do the experiencing. Every version of me exists somewhere in the branching structure of parallel realities. Every decision I make splits into further variations, and I can perceive more of them with each passing day. I still teach my classes, or rather one version of me does. Another version took a medical leave of absence 3 months after Hellam Township. A third version continued teaching but can no longer work through equations without seeing multiple solution sets simultaneously, each one valid in a different dimensional framework. I watch my students struggling to understand topology, trying to visualize spaces that exist beyond normal three-dimensional reality, and I want to tell them they're blessed to be limited to singular perception. The human mind isn't meant to comprehend the true nature of space and dimension. We're meant to experience one reality at a time, to believe in the solidity of singular existence, to trust that the choices we make collapse possibility into a single, definite outcome. I don't know which version of me is writing this account. I have memories of writing it on different days, in different locations, with different word choices. I remember finishing this sentence 5 different ways. I remember not writing this at all. All of it is true. All of it is happening. And I will never again experience the simplicity of believing in one reality, one timeline, one version of events. The gates opened my perception to the infinite, and there's no way to close it again. Have you ever experienced a moment where you remember something one way, but everyone around you insists it happened differently, and both versions feel absolutely real to you? My name is Justin, and this happened back in the summer of 1998 when I was 17 years old. I grew up in South Park Township just outside Pittsburgh, and like every teenager in the area, I'd heard the stories about the Green Man. They were everywhere, passed around at parties, and whispered during late-night drives. The legend was simple. Somewhere along Route 351, you could find a man who glowed green in the dark, a ghost or monster who walked the roads at night. Most kids treated it like a game, driving out there to catch a glimpse, to prove they were brave enough to face the local boogeyman. I was one of those stupid kids, at least for one night. What happened that evening changed me in ways I'm still discovering 27 years later. It was July 23rd, a Friday night with nothing else to do. My buddy Alex and his girlfriend Emma picked me up around 11. Emma's beat-up Honda Civic rattling down the street with the windows open and music blasting. We'd been drinking a little, not drunk, but loose enough to think the whole expedition was hilarious. Alex was driving, Emma in the passenger seat smoking a cigarette, and I was sprawled in the back making jokes about what we'd do if we actually found the Green Man. Probably scream like little kids and drive away, if I'm being honest. None of us took it seriously. It was just another excuse to drive around in the dark, to kill time before summer ended and real life started closing in. Route 351 was empty that time of night, just darkness and the occasional streetlight throwing weak yellow circles onto cracked asphalt. Alex drove slowly, all three of us peering out the windows like we were on safari. Emma kept laughing, that nervous kind of laughter people do when they're scared but don't want to admit it. I was about to suggest we give up and head to the diner when Alex hit the brakes suddenly. There, walking along the shoulder of the road maybe 50 feet ahead, was a figure. A man, walking with a distinctive rhythm, his right side dipping lower than his left. We all went silent. Emma stubbed out her cigarette. Alex put the car in park but left the headlights on, illuminating the figure ahead of us. The Green Man was real, but he wasn't glowing green. He wasn't some supernatural entity floating above the ground or radiating otherworldly light. He was just a man, an elderly man wearing normal clothes, walking his normal route. As he passed through our headlights, I saw his face, or what was left of it. The electrical accident that created the legend had destroyed his features decades ago, melting the skin and tissue, leaving behind something that barely resembled a human face. His eyes were still there, though, still human, still aware, still kind somehow, despite what had been done to him. Alex and Emma started laughing, not the nervous laughter from before, but something meaner, sharper. Emma pulled out her phone, one of those early cell phones with the terrible camera, and started taking pictures. Alex rolled down his window and said something I won't repeat, something cruel disguised as a joke. The man, Raymond Robinson, though I didn't know his name then, just kept walking. Patient. Resigned to this treatment because he'd endured it for years, for decades, from kids just like us who saw him as entertainment rather than a person. I couldn't participate. While Alex and Emma were laughing and snapping photos, I opened my door and stepped out of the car. I don't know what compelled me to do it. Guilt, maybe. Shame at being part of this ugly moment, or just basic human decency finally overriding teenage stupidity. I walked toward him, my hands shaking, and when I got close enough, I said the only thing I could think to say. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry for bothering you, for treating you like this, for making you into a story instead of seeing you as a person. He stopped walking, turned to face me fully. In the dim light, his eyes met mine, and I saw the lifetime of pain there, but also something else. Forgiveness, understanding, a patience so profound it made my chest ache. He lifted his hand, the one that was less damaged, and placed it on my shoulder. Just a brief touch, gentle and deliberate, a gesture of acceptance, of absolution for a kid who'd finally realized what he was doing. Then he continued walking, disappearing into the darkness beyond our headlights. I got back in the car. Alex and Emma were still laughing, replaying the photos on Emma's phone screen, completely unaware that anything significant had happened. I told Alex to drive, and we left. They dropped me off at home 20 minutes later, still joking about the Green Man, already planning to tell everyone at school about seeing him. I went inside, went up to my room, and lay awake until sunrise, that gentle touch replaying in my mind over and over. The next morning, I noticed the mark. On my left shoulder, exactly where he'd touched me, there was a handprint. Not a bruise, but a burn scar, the kind you'd get from sustained contact with something hot. The outline of 5 fingers, perfectly clear, pressed into my skin. It didn't hurt. It just existed, a permanent reminder of that encounter. I pulled on a long-sleeve shirt, even though it was summer, and didn't mention it to anyone. Over the following weeks, the scar started changing. The burn mark developed a faint luminescence, visible only in complete darkness. At first, I thought I was imagining it. But every night, when I turned off my bedroom light, I could see it glowing. A soft green light. Exactly the color from all those legends about the Green Man. The glow wasn't bright, barely enough to see by, but it was undeniably there. I started sleeping in long sleeves, terrified someone would notice. Then the dreams began. I dreamed I was Raymond Robinson, young and whole, walking into a tunnel on a summer day in 1919. I felt the overhead trolley wire sparking, felt the electrical arc reaching out for me like a living thing. I experienced the current surging through my body, the unbearable heat, the smell of my own flesh burning, the tunnel vision as every nerve in my body screamed. I watched my reflection in a window afterward, saw what the electricity had done to my face, my arm, my body. But worse than the physical pain was the social pain that followed. The decades of isolation, the children who ran away, screaming, the adults who stared, the teenagers who hunted him at night for entertainment, turning his tragedy into their story. I woke from these dreams understanding something fundamental about suffering and about kindness. He'd endured decades of cruelty from strangers who saw him as a monster, and still, when a stupid kid offered a sincere apology, he'd responded with forgiveness. The touch on my shoulder hadn't been a curse. It was a gift, a transfer of understanding, a way of showing me the truth behind the legend. The glow faded after about 3 months. By October, my shoulder looked normal again in the dark, but something else had changed. I could see things other people couldn't. Not supernatural things, not ghosts or monsters. I could see pain. When I looked at someone, I could perceive their suffering, their trauma, their hidden wounds. It wasn't specific knowledge, not like reading minds. It was more like an extra sense, a way of recognizing the shape of someone's hurt. A girl at school who smiled constantly. I could see the depression underneath. A teacher who seemed strict and cold. I could see the grief he was carrying from losing his wife. The bully who made everyone's life miserable. I could see the terror he felt at home. At first, it was overwhelming. Everywhere I looked, I saw pain that people were desperately trying to hide, but over time, I learned to use it. I started reaching out to people, offering small kindnesses, being present for those who needed someone to notice their struggle. I didn't tell anyone about my ability. How could I explain that a dying man's touch had given me the capacity for profound empathy? But I used it. Every day, in small ways, I tried to honor the gift I'd received. Years passed. I went to college, studied social work, eventually became a trauma counselor. The empathic sense never faded. If anything, it grew stronger. I built a career around helping people process their pain, around offering the same kind of patient understanding that Raymond Robinson had shown me that night on Route 351. I specialized in working with people who'd experienced disfigurement, who carried visible trauma, who knew what it meant to be stared at, to be turned into a story, to have their humanity obscured by other people's fear and fascination. I learned more about Raymond Robinson over the years. He died in 1985, years before my encounter with him, which means the man I met that night was either impossibly old or something else entirely. I've never been able to reconcile that fact. Maybe he survived longer than the records show. Maybe the figure we encountered was something left behind, an echo of his presence, still walking those roads, still extending forgiveness to thoughtless teenagers. I don't know. I stopped trying to find a rational explanation years ago. Sometimes late at night when I'm working with a particularly difficult case, my shoulder still glows. Just for a moment, just enough for me to notice. It happens when I'm reaching someone, when I'm breaking through their walls and helping them access the healing they need. In those moments, I feel that touch again, gentle and deliberate on my shoulder, reminding me why I do this work, reminding me that suffering can transform into compassion if we let it, That trauma doesn't have to create more trauma. That one moment of genuine human connection can redirect an entire life. I never saw Alex or Emma again after that summer. We drifted apart when school started, the natural way teenagers do. I wonder sometimes if they remember that night at all, or if it was just another forgettable adventure among dozens. I hope they do remember. I hope they eventually felt some of the shame I felt, some recognition of how we'd treated another person. But maybe they don't. Maybe I was the only one who received the gift because I was the only one who asked for it. The only one who saw past the legend to the man underneath. The scar is still there on my shoulder, visible in daylight now as just a faint outline, the permanent shape of a hand that offered forgiveness when it could have offered anything else. I touch it sometimes, tracing those 5 fingers, feeling the slightly different texture of the scarred skin. It grounds me, reminds me that the most important moments in our lives often come from the people we least expect, in the forms we aren't looking for. Raymond Robinson spent his life being someone's horror story, but he taught me something more valuable than any classroom ever could, that choosing kindness in the face of cruelty is the most powerful form of resistance, that empathy isn't weakness but strength, that we're all walking around carrying invisible wounds, and the best thing we can do is treat each other with the grace we hope to receive when our own pain becomes visible. I tell this story to my clients sometimes, the ones who are struggling with visible trauma, who feel like they'll never be seen as fully human again. I show them my shoulder, explain what it means, talk about the man who gave me this gift, and I watch their faces change as they realize that their suffering can become their superpower, that the things that hurt us most deeply can transform into the greatest sources of our compassion and strength. Have you ever received an unexpected gift from someone you initially misjudged or misunderstood? My name is Olivia, and I'm a professional urban explorer and photographer. For the past 8 years, I've documented abandoned structures across the northeastern United States, specializing in Cold War-era military installations that most people have forgotten exist. I've crawled through decommissioned missile silos, navigated crumbling bunkers, and photographed the slow decay of America's defensive infrastructure. I've seen asbestos-filled control rooms, rusted weapons caches, and enough graffiti to fill a museum. Nothing prepared me for what I discovered in White Deer Township on March 8, 2015. What started as a routine photography expedition turned into an encounter with something that shouldn't exist, something that powerful people wanted to keep buried. The Elvira bunkers are scattered across rural Pennsylvania farmland, remnants of a World War II munitions depot that operated briefly before being abandoned. Locals know about them. History buffs visit occasionally. Most of the structures are accessible, their massive concrete walls slowly being reclaimed by nature. I'd photographed 17 of them over 2 days, documenting the way vines grew through cracks in the reinforced concrete, how rust consumed the heavy steel doors, how time transformed instruments of war into monuments of obsolescence. The light that afternoon was perfect, golden hour casting long shadows across the empty fields. I was working my way through the northern section of the site when I noticed something unusual. Bunker C7 was different from the others. The entrance was sealed, but not with the kind of rusted, decades-old locks you'd expect on an abandoned military structure. These were modern padlocks, industrial-grade hardware that looked recently installed. The concrete around the doorframe had been recently patched. Fresh gravel had been spread on the access road leading to this particular bunker. Someone was maintaining this site, which made no sense for a facility that had been decommissioned 70 years ago. I circled the structure, photographing the incongruities, my professional curiosity shifting into something sharper. Something was happening here that contradicted the official narrative of abandonment. I should have left. Every instinct honed by years of exploring dangerous locations told me to document what I'd found and move on. But I've never been good at walking away from unanswered questions. I spent 40 minutes searching the perimeter until I found what I was looking for. A ventilation shaft on the north side of the bunker, partially hidden by overgrown brush. The metal grate covering it was corroded enough that I could pry it loose with my crowbar. The shaft was tight, barely wide enough for my shoulders, but I've squeezed through worse. I left my backpack at the entrance, took only my camera and flashlight, and descended into the darkness. The shaft dropped about 15 feet before opening into the bunker's interior. I landed on concrete, flooring that echoed with my footsteps, the sound wrong somehow, too clear for a space that should be filled with debris and dust. My flashlight beams swept across the interior, and I froze. The bunker wasn't empty. It wasn't abandoned. Banks of equipment lined the walls, modern electronics humming with power, LED indicators blinking in the darkness. Someone had converted this Cold War relic into an active facility, complete with battery backup systems and what looked like server racks. In the center of the space stood several metal cages, each about 6 feet square, their bars recently cleaned and maintained. The floors of the cages were scratched, deep gouges in the metal, as if something had been trying desperately to claw its way out. I started photographing everything, my hands shaking slightly as I documented the impossible. Cables ran across the floor, connecting various pieces of equipment. A desk in the corner held stacks of documents, and I rifled through them quickly, snapping photos of pages filled with technical jargon and classified stamps. The heading on most documents read Project Nightfall, followed by dates ranging from 2012 to 2014. The text described psychological warfare experiments, testing the effects of specific sound frequencies on human subjects. The goal was to develop a weapon that could induce extreme paranoia, violent behavior, and complete psychological breakdown without leaving physical evidence. The frequencies would be undetectable to most people, but devastating to those specifically targeted. I found medical reports documenting the progression of test subjects exposed to various frequency patterns. Subject 7 exhibited increasing aggression after 48 hours of exposure. Subject 12 developed severe paranoia and attacked medical staff. Subject 19 demonstrated complete personality dissociation. The clinical language couldn't disguise what I was reading. Human experimentation conducted on American soil within the last 3 years. The subjects were identified only by numbers, but handwritten notes in the margins suggested they were homeless individuals, people without families, who wouldn't be immediately missed if they disappeared. That's when I heard it. A low-frequency hum, so deep I felt it in my chest cavity before I consciously registered it as sound. The equipment around me had activated, lights shifting from standby mode to active operation. I didn't trigger anything. There must have been sensors, motion detectors I'd missed in my initial assessment. The frequency increased gradually, building in intensity until my teeth ached and my vision started to blur at the edges. I tried to move toward the ventilation shaft, but my coordination was deteriorating. My hands felt disconnected from my body, like I was operating them remotely with a significant lag. The hallucinations started within minutes. I watched myself from outside my body, a third-person perspective that felt absolutely real. I could see myself stumbling through the bunker trying to reach the exit. But from this external viewpoint, I also saw something else. There were others in the bunker with me. Figures in the shadows, moving with predatory intent, closing in from all sides. I knew intellectually that they weren't real, that the frequency was causing sensory distortions, but knowing didn't help. The primal part of my brain, the part that processes threats before conscious thought intervenes, believed completely in what I was seeing. I remember screaming. I remember trying to fight off attackers that didn't exist. I remember the absolute certainty that I was going to die in that concrete box, trapped and forgotten, like the numbered subjects in those medical reports. Time became elastic, stretching and compressing unpredictably. Minutes felt like hours. Then suddenly the frequency stopped. The equipment powered down. The hallucinations evaporated instantly, leaving me gasping on the cold floor, drenched in sweat, my throat raw from screaming. I don't know how long I lay there. Long enough for my hands to stop shaking enough to climb back through the ventilation shaft. Long enough to realize that whatever automated system had activated would likely alert whoever was running this operation. I retrieved my backpack and ran. Didn't stop running until I reached my car parked 2 miles away on a service road. My camera held hundreds of photos documenting everything I'd seen. Proof. Undeniable evidence of illegal human experimentation on American citizens. I called the state police from a gas station 20 miles away, told them everything, gave them the exact coordinates of Bunker C7, described what I'd found. The officer I spoke with was polite, professional, and clearly skeptical. But he took my statement, said they'd send someone to investigate. I drove home to Philadelphia, locked myself in my apartment, and backed up all my photos to 3 different cloud storage services. I wasn't naive. I knew how these things worked. People who stumbled onto classified operations had a way of disappearing or being discredited. 2 days later, the police called to inform me they'd investigated the site. According to their report, Bunker C7 was empty, completely vacant except for some old furniture and typical abandoned building debris. No equipment, no cages, no documents, nothing that matched my description. They asked if I was sure I had the right location. I insisted I did. They suggested perhaps I'd been mistaken, that in the dark all those bunkers probably looked similar. The tone was polite but dismissive. I went back myself 3 days after that. Brought a friend for safety, someone I trusted. We entered through the same ventilation shaft. The bunker was exactly as the police described. Empty. The concrete floor showed no sign that heavy equipment had ever been installed. The walls were bare except for rust stains. Even the scratches I'd seen in those metal cages were gone, because the cages themselves had vanished. Someone had scrubbed that location clean in less than 48 hours, removing every trace of what I'd documented. But I still had the photographs. Hundreds of them, clear and detailed. I pulled up the files on my laptop to show my friend. That's when I discovered the corruption. Every single photo I'd taken inside Bunker C7 was damaged. Digital artifacts scattered across the images, making them blurry and indistinct. You could see shapes that might have been equipment, or might have been shadows. Text that might have been documents, or might have been random patterns. Nothing was clear enough to serve as evidence. Nothing was definitive enough to prove what I'd seen. The physical prints I'd made before the police investigation were slightly better. You could make out the general layout of equipment, the suggestion of cages. But without the digital originals, without the ability to enhance and clarify the images, they were just ambiguous photographs of an empty bunker. I showed them to journalist contacts, to military historians, to anyone I thought might take me seriously. Most looked at the blurry prints and saw nothing unusual. Some suggested I'd misinterpreted what I'd seen. Others implied I might have fabricated the story for attention. The worst part wasn't the disbelief. It was the certainty that I'd been exposed to that frequency, that my brain had been temporarily rewired by a weapon designed to destroy minds. I still hear it sometimes, usually at night, when ambient noise drops to near silence. A low hum just at the edge of perception, vibrating in my chest cavity. I know it's not real. I know it's a phantom sensation, my nervous system replaying trauma. But knowing doesn't make it stop. I dream about being trapped in that bunker, watching myself from outside my body while invisible attackers close in from the shadows. I've continued my urban exploration work, documented dozens of sites since March 2015, but I'm more careful now. I don't investigate locations that seem too well maintained. I don't ignore fresh locks on supposedly abandoned buildings. And I never, ever enter a space without multiple witnesses and live streaming backup. Because I learned something in Bunker C7 that changed how I see the world. Our government is still conducting experiments that would horrify the public if they ever came to light, and they have the resources to make evidence disappear completely. Project Nightfall is still out there somewhere. The bunker was just one location, probably one of many. The numbered subjects from those medical reports are real people who suffered and possibly died so weapons developers could perfect a tool for invisible warfare. And there's nothing I can do about it. No one to tell who has the power to investigate. No evidence solid enough to force accountability. Just my testimony, easily dismissed as the confusion of an amateur photographer who got lost in the dark and let her imagination run wild. Would you believe me if I showed you those blurry photographs, knowing that powerful institutions insist they show nothing unusual? My name is Finn, and I've worked as a wildlife biologist for the Pennsylvania Game Commission for 11 years. Most of that time has been spent studying deer populations, tracking migration patterns, and monitoring ecosystem health across the state's wilderness areas. It's methodical work, driven by data collection and scientific observation. Nothing in my training prepared me for what I encountered in Clearfield County during the winter of 2012. What started as an investigation into unusual animal deaths became something else entirely. An encounter with a creature that shouldn't exist but does. Something ancient and patient and terrifyingly intelligent that lives in the mountains and waits for the right conditions to hunt. The first reports came in on February 19, 2012. Local hunters had discovered deer carcasses near the area around Bloody Knox Cabin, a historical site deep in the state forest. Deer deaths aren't unusual during harsh winters, but these kills showed characteristics that didn't match known predator patterns. The Game Commission sent me to investigate because I'd written my thesis on predator-prey relationships in Pennsylvania wildlife. I expected to find evidence of coyotes, or possibly a black bear emerging early from hibernation. I packed my field equipment, drove 3 hours north, and hiked 2 miles through snow-covered forest to reach the site. The carcasses were arranged wrong. That was my first observation. 5 adult deer, each one positioned roughly 20 feet from the others, forming a geometric pattern that nature doesn't create randomly. Deer fleeing predators scatter. Deer dying from disease or starvation drop where they fall. These bodies had been moved deliberately, placed with intention. I photographed the layout, took GPS coordinates, and began examining the nearest carcass. The deer had been drained almost completely of blood, but there were no significant wounds beyond a single puncture at the base of the skull. The flesh around that puncture showed signs of extreme cold damage, like frostbite, concentrated in one small area. The rest of the animal appeared untouched. No signs of feeding, no scavenging damage, just that single precise wound and the absence of blood. I found the tracks about 30 yards from the kill site. They started as human footprints, clear impressions in the snow showing someone walking in boots. But as I followed the trail, the prints changed. The stride lengthened gradually, stretching from a normal 2-foot pace to nearly 4 feet between steps. The depth of the impressions increased, suggesting the walker was getting heavier, and the shape transformed, the boot outline giving way to something broader, with claw marks visible at the front. I measured and photographed each change, watching human tracks morph into something else over the span of maybe 50 feet. The trail led toward a frozen creek and disappeared at the ice edge. I reported my findings to my supervisor that evening, keeping my description clinical and factual, unusual predation pattern, unknown animal responsible, tracks suggesting something capable of bipedal locomotion. I recommended setting up trail cameras and conducting additional surveys. What I didn't mention was the feeling I'd had standing in that clearing. The absolute certainty that I was being watched from the tree line, that something was observing me with the same analytical attention I was bringing to the investigation. Scientists aren't supposed to include feelings in their reports, so I left that part out. The local hunters I interviewed over the next few days were more direct than my carefully worded reports. They'd seen something in the woods, a figure that walked upright like a person but moved wrong, joints bending in directions human anatomy doesn't allow, skin that looked frost-burned, blue-white like flesh that had frozen and partially thawed, eyes that reflected light like a deer's, that yellow-green shine when a flashlight catches them. One man described hearing his own voice coming from the darkness. Words he'd spoken earlier played back to him perfectly. Another had found tracks similar to what I'd documented, trails that showed transformation from human to something else. I spent 2 weeks investigating, set up motion-activated cameras throughout the area, collected hair samples from branches near the kill sites, documented 3 more incidents of the same predation pattern, geometric arrangements of drained deer carcasses. The hair samples came back inconclusive, showing characteristics that didn't match any known mammal in the region. The trail cameras captured hundreds of images of normal wildlife and 3 frames of something else. A tall figure, humanoid but wrong, standing at the edge of camera range. The images were too distant and too brief for detailed analysis, but they showed something real, something physical occupying space in front of the camera lens. On March 3rd, I went back to the site alone for a night observation. Standard protocol when dealing with nocturnal predators. I set up a blind near the creek, positioned myself downwind, and waited. Temperature dropped below 0 after sunset. The forest went completely silent. That absolute quiet that only happens in deep winter when every other living thing has bedded down or migrated. I sat in that silence for 3 hours, watching my breath fog in the frigid air before I heard the footsteps. Something was walking through the snow behind my position. The footfalls were rhythmic but wrong, too far apart for human stride, too heavy for deer. I stayed motionless in my blind, barely breathing, listening as whatever it was circled my location. Closer, then farther, then closer again. Testing. Investigating. The same way I'd been investigating it. Then the footsteps stopped directly behind me. I could hear breathing, slow and deliberate. I could smell it. Mineral scent like cave water and frozen meat. And then it spoke. It used my voice, my exact voice, saying words I'd spoken earlier that day during a phone call with my supervisor. Perfect replication, not mimicry, but recording and playback. My speech patterns and inflections captured and reproduced. The thing behind me said, "I'm going to stay overnight at the site. Need to document nocturnal activity patterns." My own words, given back to me from something that shouldn't be able to form human speech. I turned slowly, expecting to die. That's not dramatic exaggeration. In that moment, I was absolutely certain I was about to be killed. What I saw standing 15 feet away, partially illuminated by moonlight reflecting off snow, was nightmare given physical form. It stood upright, maybe 7 feet tall, with proportions that suggested human ancestry, but had diverged into something else. The skin was pale blue-white, adapted for extreme cold, covered in a fine layer of what might have been frost or might have been natural insulation. The face retained human features, eyes and nose and mouth, but the skull had elongated, the jaw extended, the teeth visible behind partially retracted lips. Its arms hung too long, the joints articulated differently than human shoulders and elbows should allow. And the eyes. Those eyes tracked me with intelligence, curiosity, assessment. This wasn't an animal acting on instinct. This was something thinking, planning, deciding. We stared at each other for what felt like an hour, but was probably less than a minute. Then it spoke again, this time using my supervisor's voice from that same phone call. keep me updated on any developments. It tilted its head, watching my reaction, gauging whether I understood what it was demonstrating. That it had been listening, learning, mimicking not just sounds but context, playing back relevant portions of overheard conversations. Then it turned and walked away. I watched it move through the forest, that impossible gait, joints bending in ways that let it navigate terrain that would slow a human to a crawl. It reached the frozen creek, stepped onto the ice, and kept walking until darkness swallowed it. I stayed in my blind until dawn, too terrified to move, certain that if I tried to leave, it would return. I filed a report that was technically accurate but completely inadequate. Unknown predator species, possible primate, recommend further study. My supervisor read it, looked at me like I'd lost my mind, and suggested I take some time off. When I pushed for additional resources, mentioned the need for a comprehensive investigation, he shut me down. Budget constraints, other priorities, insufficient evidence to justify expanded operations. The subtext was clear. Drop it. The area was temporarily closed to hunting while they conducted what they called a safety review. Teams went in, found nothing unusual, reopened the area 6 weeks later. No official mention of strange predation patterns or unidentified species. The trail camera images disappeared from the evidence log. My detailed reports were summarized into a brief note about coyote activity and filed away. But I kept tracking it. Off the books, on my own time. Similar patterns appeared 60 miles north 3 years later. Geometric arrangements of deer carcasses during a late winter thaw. Tracks that transformed from human to something else. Local reports of a figure in the woods that moved wrong and mimicked voices. Then again, in 2018, different location, same pattern. It migrates. Follows some route through the mountains, appearing in different areas during specific conditions, probably related to temperature and prey availability. I've mapped the incidents over the past 13 years. There's a pattern, though I can't predict it precisely. Certain valleys, certain elevation ranges, always during late winter when the weather fluctuates between freeze and thaw. I think there might be more than one. The geographic range is too large for a single creature to cover, even accounting for migration. Maybe 3 or 4, moving through established territories, hunting when conditions are right, and hibernating or hiding when they're not. The Native American pictographs I found in a cave system near one of the kill sites suggest this thing has been here much longer than a few years. The drawings show similar creatures, bipedal figures with elongated proportions, surrounded by geometric patterns and winter symbols. Warnings, maybe. Documentation of something that shared these mountains with humans for centuries. Something people encountered and feared and recorded in the only way they knew how. I'll never get official recognition for this discovery. The Game Commission won't acknowledge something they can't control or explain. But I know what's in those mountains. I know it's intelligent enough to study humans the same way we study wildlife. It watches, it learns, it mimics our voices and understands context. And sometime in the future, probably during another late winter thaw, it will kill again. Someone will find deer arranged in patterns that shouldn't exist. Someone will see tracks that transform from human to monster. And maybe they'll report it. And maybe someone like me will investigate. And maybe the cycle will continue because we've decided as a society that some truths are too uncomfortable to acknowledge. I still hear my own voice sometimes in the darkness, speaking words I said years ago near that frozen creek. Phantom echoes of a conversation with something that shouldn't exist. Reminders that intelligence comes in forms we aren't prepared to recognize. That we share this world with creatures we've decided to ignore rather than confront. And I wonder if it remembers me the same way I remember it. 2 curious investigators who met briefly in the cold and dark, each trying to understand the other across a gulf too wide for meaningful communication. If something in the woods ever calls to you in a voice you recognize, would you answer? My name is Charlotte, and for 23 years I worked as a real estate agent specializing in estate sales and property liquidation in Chester County, Pennsylvania. The job involved walking through houses where people had lived entire lifetimes, sorting through their possessions, preparing their homes for sale after they'd passed away. Most estates were unremarkable, filled with the ordinary accumulation of decades lived quietly. Furniture, photographs, kitchen appliances, the mundane artifacts of existence. But in November 2003, I entered a property on Cossert Road that changed everything I thought I understood about the nature of evil and how easily it hides in plain sight. The house belonged to a deceased physician whose practice had closed in 1987. He died alone at age 94, no living relatives, his estate in probate for nearly 2 years, before I was hired to prepare the property for sale. Cossert Road had a reputation locally. People called it Devil's Road because of some legend about trees growing away from the street instead of toward sunlight. I'd driven past the property dozens of times over the years, never paying much attention to the old Victorian house set back from the road behind overgrown hedges. On November 4th, 2003, I unlocked the front door for the first time and stepped into a space that had been sealed and untouched since the doctor's death. The house smelled wrong immediately. Not the typical mustiness of abandonment, but something sharper underneath, chemical and organic at once. I opened windows on the first floor, letting autumn air circulate through rooms filled with antique medical equipment and shelves of leather-bound journals. The doctor had apparently brought his work home, converting what should have been a dining room into something resembling an examination space, complete with an old surgical table and glass cabinets filled with instruments. I cataloged everything methodically, taking photographs and notes for the estate inventory. The upstairs bedrooms were less cluttered, just furniture and personal items, clothing still hanging in closets after 16 years. I found the basement door behind a bookshelf in what had been the doctor's study. Not hidden exactly, but obscured, like something he accessed regularly, but preferred visitors not to notice. The door was locked, but the key hung on a hook just inside the study closet, labeled simply B in faded ink. I should have called someone before going down there. Standard procedure when encountering locked spaces in estate properties is to have a witness present, protection against accusations of theft or mishandling. But I'd been doing this job for over 2 decades. I'd opened hundreds of locked doors and never found anything more disturbing than hoarded newspapers or amateur taxidermy projects. I turned the key, pulled open the door, and descended wooden stairs into darkness that smelled overwhelmingly of formaldehyde. The basement had been converted into a laboratory. Workbenches lined the walls, equipped with burners, microscopes, and racks of empty test tubes. Filing cabinets stood in perfect rows, each drawer labeled with date ranges spanning from 1943 to 1984. But what dominated the space were the shelves, floor-to-ceiling shelving units covering 3 walls, holding hundreds of glass specimen jars. I approached slowly, my flashlight beam moving across jar after jar of preserved tissue. Human tissue. Organs, bone fragments, cross-sections of muscle, teeth, skin samples, all suspended in clear preservative fluid. Each jar bore a label with initials, a date, and an alphanumeric code. I stood frozen in that basement for probably 10 minutes, my mind refusing to process what I was seeing. These weren't medical school specimens. This wasn't a teaching collection. The labels were too recent, the dates extending into the 1980s. I forced myself to move, to investigate further, already knowing this had crossed from estate sale into crime scene. I opened the nearest filing cabinet and found detailed records, patient files, except the patients had never been patients in any legitimate sense. Each folder contained intake information, physical descriptions, medical histories extracted through what the notes described as preliminary interviews. Then came procedure logs, documenting surgical experiments performed on living subjects, tracking their responses, their survival rates, the quality of tissue samples harvested. I found photographs in the bottom drawer, clinical images showing people restrained on surgical tables, procedures being performed in what I recognized as that very basement. The subjects were conscious in many of the photos, eyes wide with terror. The doctor had documented his work meticulously, the way a researcher might document laboratory experiments, except his subjects weren't lab animals. They were human beings, vagrants and drifters based on the intake notes, people without families or stable addresses, individuals whose disappearances wouldn't trigger immediate investigations. He'd been selecting victims carefully, targeting society's most vulnerable, performing unauthorized medical experiments under the guise of offering free treatment. The journals on the workbench provided context I wished I'd never discovered. The doctor had convinced himself he was advancing medical science, that his research into tissue regeneration and genetic manipulation required live human subjects. He documented his rationale across hundreds of pages, justifying each procedure as necessary for the greater good. The journals detailed 41 years of systematic torture disguised as research. He'd started during World War II, apparently inspired by reports of experiments conducted in concentration camps, believing that American medicine was falling behind in areas where ethics prevented conventional research. He'd continued after the war ended, developing techniques to procure subjects, perfect his procedures, and dispose of evidence. The disposal method became clear when I found the property survey tucked into one of the journals. He'd marked locations across the 5-acre property, coordinates that I realized represented burial sites. 47 marks total, each one presumably the final resting place of someone whose tissue now floated in a labeled jar on these shelves. 47 people who'd sought medical help from a licensed physician and instead became research subjects, their bodies harvested for tissue samples and buried in unmarked graves beneath Pennsylvania soil. I called the police from my cell phone, standing in that basement surrounded by jars of preserved human remains. I described what I'd found as calmly as possible, though my voice shook badly enough that the dispatcher asked twice if I was in immediate danger. I climbed back upstairs to wait for them, standing on the front porch because I couldn't remain inside that house. 2 officers arrived within 20 minutes, followed shortly by detectives and eventually forensics teams. I walked them through what I'd discovered, watched them photograph the basement laboratory, heard their radio calls requesting additional personnel and expertise. The investigation that followed consumed 6 months. Forensic anthropologists excavated the property, recovering remains from 41 of the 47 marked locations. Weather and time had destroyed some of the evidence, but enough remained for identification in many cases. Cross-referencing the initials on specimen jars with missing persons reports from multiple decades, investigators matched 29 victims to actual people who disappeared between 1945 and 1983. Mostly men, though not exclusively. Mostly individuals experiencing homelessness or transient lifestyles. People who society had failed, who'd fallen through cracks, who'd trusted a doctor offering free medical care. The physician himself had died peacefully in a nursing home, never questioned, never suspected, his medical license active until his death. His colleagues remembered him as dedicated and somewhat reclusive. His former patients, the legitimate ones who'd visited his practice for ordinary medical care, described him as thorough and professional. No one suspected that his basement contained evidence of crimes that would have rivaled any serial killer in American history. 41 years of systematic murder disguised as medical research, documented with the same careful attention he'd apparently brought to his legitimate practice. The house was eventually demolished. The property was seized by the state, designated as a memorial site for the identified victims and those who remained nameless. I attended the dedication ceremony in 2004, standing among family members of people who'd been missing for decades, watching them finally receive answers about what had happened to loved ones who'd vanished into the anonymous margins of society. Some families were grateful for closure. Others were destroyed by the details of how their relatives had died, the suffering they'd endured in that basement laboratory while a respected physician documented their pain. I've handled hundreds of estates since November 2003, but I've never forgotten that basement. I still see those specimen jars in my dreams, rows and rows of preserved tissue, each one representing a person who died in terror and agony. I think about how the doctor had lived his double life so successfully, respected professional by day, sadistic researcher by night. I wonder how many similar monsters are hiding behind licenses and credentials, performing horrors in private while maintaining public respectability. The psychological impact lasted years. I developed severe anxiety about basements, about doctors, about any situation where someone has absolute power over another human being. I went through 2 years of therapy processing what I'd witnessed, learning to separate my rational understanding that most physicians are genuinely caring people from the visceral terror that had attached itself to medical settings. I eventually returned to work, though I transferred to commercial real estate, selling office buildings and retail spaces instead of estates. I couldn't walk through dead people's houses anymore, couldn't open their doors and sort through their possessions without wondering what horrors might be hidden in locked rooms. The community wanted to forget. Within a few years, mention of the case faded from local news. New horrors replaced old ones in public consciousness. But the families haven't forgotten. I still receive calls occasionally from relatives of the unidentified victims, people hoping that new forensic techniques might finally match their missing loved one to one of the anonymous specimens. I tell them what I can, provide contact information for the detective who still maintains the case file, offer what small comfort comes from knowing someone remembers. I've thought often about the last journal entry I read before calling police. The doctor had written it 3 days before his death, his handwriting shaky but still legible. He expressed no remorse, no recognition that what he'd done was monstrous. Instead, he lamented that his research would die with him, that all the knowledge he'd accumulated through decades of human experimentation would be lost because society was too squeamish to acknowledge the necessity of his work. He genuinely believed he'd been performing a service, that his victims were acceptable sacrifices on the altar of medical advancement. That level of self-delusion, that complete absence of empathy, frightened me more than the preserved organs or the buried bodies. Evil that knows itself is somehow less terrifying than evil that believes itself righteous. I keep one photograph from that day, not from the basement, but from outside the house. The trees along Cossert Road really do grow away from the street, bending backward in ways that seem to defy their search for sunlight. Legend says the trees recognize evil and recoil from it. I don't believe in supernatural explanations, but I understand why people created that story. Some places absorb the horror that happens within them. Some houses remember, and sometimes nature itself seems to turn away in revulsion from what humans are capable of doing to each other. Would you want to know if someone in your community had hidden something this terrible for decades, or would you rather never find out? My name is Abraham, and I work as a signal engineer for a telecommunications company based in Allentown. For 15 years, I've tracked frequencies, mapped signal patterns, and solved interference problems across eastern Pennsylvania. It's technical work, precise and predictable, governed by physics and FCC regulations. Nothing in my professional experience prepared me for what I discovered on September 12, 2017, when I detected an impossible broadcast coming from a location that shouldn't have been transmitting anything at all. What began as a routine signal investigation became something far darker, a discovery that forced me to confront the most disturbing truth I've ever encountered about human nature and my own capacity for violence. I first noticed the anomaly during a routine spectrum analysis sweep. Someone was broadcasting on a dead AM frequency, one that hadn't been licensed for use in decades. The signal was strong, localized, originating somewhere in the Easton area. Unauthorized broadcasts aren't uncommon, usually amateur radio enthusiasts operating slightly outside legal parameters, easily resolved with a warning letter. But this signal had unusual characteristics. The waveform showed digital encoding embedded in an analog carrier, a sophisticated hybrid approach that shouldn't exist on equipment from the AM era. I spent 2 days triangulating the source, using directional antennas and GPS tracking to narrow down the origin point to an abandoned radio station about 6 miles outside Easton proper. The building had been defunct since the late 80s, part of a small AM station that went bankrupt when FM formats took over the market. I'd driven past it dozens of times without paying attention. Just another piece of industrial decay slowly being reclaimed by weeds and weather. But when I arrived on September 12th with my tracking equipment, I immediately noticed something wrong. The chain-link fence surrounding the property had fresh padlocks. The access road showed recent tire tracks. Someone was maintaining this supposedly abandoned site. I parked a quarter mile away and approached on foot, carrying my signal analyzer and a flashlight, telling myself I was just investigating an unauthorized transmission, nothing more complicated than that. The front entrance was secured, but a side window had been left partially open, probably for ventilation. I'm not proud of entering private property without authorization, but my job requires determining the source of illegal broadcasts, and technically, I had legitimate professional reasons for being there. I squeezed through the window into what had been the station's office area, my footsteps echoing on bare concrete floors. The broadcast signal was much stronger inside, my analyzer showing peak strength coming from deeper in the building. I followed the signal toward the back, where the actual transmission equipment would have been located decades ago. The studio was still operational. Not just operational, but upgraded, ancient vacuum tube equipment somehow integrated with modern digital processors and satellite uplinks. Someone had invested serious resources into converting this abandoned station into an active broadcast facility. All of it completely off the books. No licensing, no legal authorization. Banks of servers hummed quietly against one wall, their LED indicators blinking in rhythmic patterns. The transmitter itself was running, pumping out that strange hybrid signal I'd detected from miles away. I started photographing everything, documenting the setup for my report, already planning the notification I'd send to the FCC about this illegal operation. That's when I actually listened to what was being broadcast. I pulled the headphones from my analyzer and connected them to the monitoring station, adjusting frequencies until I isolated the audio content. What I heard was a voice, heavily distorted through some kind of digital processing, reading what sounded like a list. Coordinates, dates, and names. I grabbed my notebook and started transcribing. The voice said 41.673 north, 75.218 west, September 3rd, 2003, followed by a name I recognized. Not personally, but from news coverage years earlier. A missing person case that had eventually been solved when they found her body. The coordinates matched the discovery location. The date matched when she disappeared. I kept listening, transcribing more entries. Every set of coordinates, every date, every name corresponded to a documented crime. Murders, mostly, but also disappearances that were eventually classified as homicides. I cross-referenced several entries on my phone, pulling up old news articles, and the pattern held consistent. Whoever was broadcasting this signal was listing solved crimes, providing accurate information about victims and locations. But here's what made my hand start shaking as I wrote. The broadcast was a loop, about 47 minutes long, and each time it repeated, small details changed. The coordinates shifted slightly. The dates altered by a day or two. The voice inflection varied on certain words. I sat in that abandoned studio for over 3 hours, listening to the loop cycle through multiple iterations, documenting the changes. Then I heard something that made my blood freeze. The voice read out coordinates in Philadelphia, September 13th, 2017, and spoke my own name. Tomorrow's date. My name. I played it back 3 times to make sure I wasn't mishearing, but there was no mistake. The broadcast was including future information, events that hadn't happened yet, and I was listed among them. I checked the coordinates on my GPS unit. They corresponded to a specific address in Philadelphia, a location I'd never been to, in a neighborhood I had no reason to visit. The rational part of my brain tried to find explanations. Someone was running an elaborate hoax. The name was a coincidence. Someone else, named Abraham. The coordinates were randomly generated, but I couldn't dismiss the accuracy of all the past entries I'd verified. This wasn't random. The broadcast contained real information about actual crimes. And now it was predicting something that involved me, something scheduled to happen tomorrow. I took extensive photos of the equipment, recorded segments of the broadcast, and left the building with the intention of reporting everything to the authorities. Let them figure out what this installation was doing and who was responsible for it. Driving home, I couldn't stop thinking about those coordinates. The obsessive part of my personality, the part that made me good at solving signal problems, couldn't leave the mystery alone. What was at that location? Why was my name associated with it? What was supposedly going to happen tomorrow? I detoured into Philadelphia, telling myself I'd just drive past the address, satisfy my curiosity, then go home and file my reports. The coordinates led me to a residential street in a working-class neighborhood. Houses packed close together, cars parked along both curbs. I drove slowly past the specified location, a narrow alley between 2 row houses, and saw a woman walking alone toward that alley entrance. I watched her turn into the alley, and some part of my brain, some dark mechanism I didn't know existed, calculated the attack. She was isolated. The alley was poorly lit. No witnesses visible on the street. My car was anonymous. No one would connect me to this location. The thought emerged fully formed, not building gradually, but arriving complete and detailed. A perfect plan for grabbing her, dragging her deeper into that alley, killing her before she could scream loud enough to draw attention. I felt my hands tighten on the steering wheel, my foot easing off the brake, my body preparing to execute an action I would never, could never, should never take. Then I understood. The broadcast didn't predict crimes. It commanded them. The equipment in that abandoned station wasn't just transmitting information. It was transmitting intention, planting detailed murder plans into the minds of listeners. Everyone who heard their name and coordinates in that distorted voice received the same thing I just experienced. A complete, actionable plan to commit violence. The signal was weaponized, designed to bypass conscious decision-making and implant violent impulses directly into the subconscious. I'd been exposed for hours, listening intently, and now my brain was trying to execute programming I'd unknowingly received. I drove away from that street, my entire body shaking, fighting against impulses that felt simultaneously foreign and completely natural. I pulled into a parking lot 3 blocks away and sat there for 20 minutes, concentrating on breathing, on reasserting conscious control over actions I'd nearly taken. The woman in the alley was safe, because I'd recognized what was happening in Time to Resist. But how many other people had heard that broadcast over the weeks or months it had been running? How many had heard their names, driven to the specified coordinates, and followed through on the implanted commands without understanding what was controlling them? I went home and spent the night researching unsolved murders in the Philadelphia area, cross-referencing dates and locations with entries I'd transcribed from the broadcast. I found correlations. Not every entry matched an unsolved case, but enough did to establish a pattern. Crimes committed by people with no apparent motive, no connection to the victims, no clear explanation for why they'd suddenly committed violence completely out of character. I was looking at evidence of dozens of murders committed by ordinary people who'd been turned into remote-controlled killers through exposure to that signal. The next morning, I contacted the FCC, local police, and the FBI. I provided all my documentation, the photos of the equipment, recordings of the broadcast, my analysis of the signal characteristics, and my theory about what the installation was actually doing. The responses ranged from polite skepticism to outright dismissal. The FCC said they'd investigate the unauthorized broadcast. The police thanked me for the information, but seemed more concerned about me having entered the property illegally. The FBI took a report, but made no commitments about follow-up. Nobody seemed willing to seriously consider that a radio broadcast could be weaponized to compel criminal behavior. 3 days later, I drove back to the abandoned station. The building was completely empty. All the equipment had been removed, every server, every processor, every cable stripped out. The concrete floor showed marks where the racks had stood, but the space was otherwise bare. Someone had cleared out the entire operation in less than 72 hours, leaving no evidence beyond my photographs and recordings. I contacted all the agencies I'd reported to, told them the site had been cleared. They said they'd noted in their files, but offered no explanation for how such a sophisticated installation could be dismantled and removed so quickly. My recordings became the only physical evidence that the broadcast had existed. I analyzed them extensively, trying to understand the mechanism by which the signal influenced behavior. The audio contained subliminal frequencies layered beneath the spoken content, pulses timed to match neural oscillation patterns associated with decision-making and impulse control. Whoever designed this system understood neuroscience at a level that suggested serious research backing. This wasn't amateur work. This was a professional weapons development project, testing how effectively people could be turned into unwitting assassins through targeted broadcast exposure. I've continued monitoring that frequency, scanning for any resurgence of the signal. It's remained silent since September 2017, but I've tracked similar reports from other states, incidents of people committing inexplicable violence, describing feeling compelled to travel to specific locations and harm strangers for no reason they can articulate. I've tried connecting investigators to my findings, offering my analysis of the broadcast mechanism. Most don't respond. The few who do suggest I might benefit from psychiatric evaluation, that perhaps my stress over the illegal broadcast discovery triggered some kind of breakdown. The worst part isn't the dismissal or the knowledge that whoever built that system might be operating similar installations elsewhere. The worst part is knowing what I almost did. That moment sitting in my car watching that woman walk into the alley, feeling the complete certainty that I was going to kill her, experiencing it not as temptation, but as inevitable action. That moment revealed something about human agency I can never unlearn. We like to believe we're in control of our actions, that our choices belong to us. But I felt my brain being overridden, watched my body preparing to execute commands from an external source, and barely retained enough conscious awareness to resist. I still hear that distorted voice sometimes, usually when I'm trying to sleep, reading coordinates, speaking names, planting intentions in receptive minds. I know it's just memory, phantom replay of trauma, but the fear remains that the signal never really stopped, that maybe some part of it embedded itself permanently, a dormant program waiting for the right trigger to execute. I've never returned to that Philadelphia neighborhood. I've avoided the street where I almost committed murder under someone else's control, and I live with the certainty that other people weren't as lucky as me, weren't able to recognize and resist the programming, and acted out violence they would never have chosen if they'd maintained control of their own minds. Can you truly trust every decision you make? Or might some impulses come from sources you never consented to? My name is Mia, and I've spent the past 7 years as a hospice nurse. I've been with dozens of patients through the deepest valleys of illness, listened to their hopes and regrets as the end drew near, and at Hillview Manor in Newcastle, Pennsylvania, I learned just how thin the curtain between life and death truly can be. In April 2021, what began as a temp assignment in an aging care facility became the most quietly chilling chapter of my life, lingering long after the last goodbye. The first day I entered Hillview Manor, the building itself felt different from the dozen other facilities where I'd worked. Its interior had been partially renovated, but all the cosmetic changes couldn't hide the old bones underneath. Long hallways of linoleum patched over warehouse sorrow, walls too thick with paint to forget what they'd seen. The main exit area still wore signs of its past as an almshouse, and the doors behind the nurses' station had glass so aged it looked fogged even on a dry spring day. I signed in as usual, balancing a clipboard and thermos, then met Timothy, another nurse on staff. He'd been there for years and greeted me with a tight-lipped smile, eyes kind but almost apologetic. "You'll get used to the morning sounds," he told me, and I laughed, thinking he meant grumpy patients or squeaky carts. I would later realize there were other sounds to get used to, ones you couldn't explain away as pipes or footsteps. I was assigned to Marjorie's wing. Most patients were elderly, many nonverbal or living in fragmented swaths of memory. Marjorie, though, was sharp. She remembered her own admissions and departures, and she had a clear-eyed way of looking at the world that left you feeling exposed, but seen. On my third day, as I closed the curtain around her bed for a morning change, she looked straight at me and said, "Don't worry about the ones who wander, honey. They're gentle, lonely. They just don't know it yet." I assumed she meant other residents prone to midnight bathroom trips, nodded, and made a joke about lost slippers and wandering shadows. Marjorie only smiled, knowingly, not correcting me. I caught a whiff of lavender, outdated, a powdered perfume almost no one wore anymore. The room was cold, even though the radiators hummed on. That night, during rounds, I heard my name spoken from the end of the hall, clear as a bell. Startled, I turned, but saw nothing. All my patients were accounted for. A nurse's mind invents explanations. Maybe another staffer. Maybe hospital acoustics bouncing voices strange. I brushed it off. But over the next week, oddities grew. The call buttons in 2 empty rooms lit up at random, and when I checked, the pressure mats showed weight as if someone had just left the bed. Timothy shrugged. Ghost-like consistency. They don't cause problems. He said it just like that, matter of fact. The true strangeness began with Marjorie's stories. She would recount exact names. Joseph in 14A passed last spring, then came back. Bernice with the songs down in 16B, she still hums every Wednesday. And every name and date she mentioned checked out in the old records. She described seeing former roommates sitting on the radiator outside their old doors, recalled overhearing nurses who'd worked there decades before, and cited room numbers that had supposedly been unused for years. When I offered gentle contradiction, she met my doubt with a calm stare and told me not to worry. Everyone stays, eventually. They just wait for the right face to remember them by. I saw Marjorie's breath mist one night while she spoke. Even though the air was still and there was no chill, my own experiences with the inexplicable escalated. Working night shift, I would sense pressure on beds that had just been made, or see the indent of a form settling into a favorite chair moments after a patient's passing. Shadows lingered in the edges of fluorescent light, and sometimes the scent of tobacco or old rose water would fill a cleaning closet that hadn't been opened in ages. Sometimes the air would turn unnaturally cold for just a moment, sending goosebumps up my arms. I found an old teacup in Marjorie's nightstand. She insisted it was a gift from a friend who visited from the old side, though no family came that week. When Marjorie's health sharply declined, I found myself at her side for extra hours. She asked only that I promise not to fear what I could not change. Take care of the new arrivals, and listen for the names you don't yet know, she whispered. The room seemed to pulse with her heartbeat. Then, when she was gone, the air emptied. I thought the tension would finally lift. But 2 nights later, as I finished my charting after midnight, I looked up to see Marjorie wandering the corridor, hospital gown trailing, her slippers making no sound at all. She smiled when our eyes met. The aroma of lavender grew stronger, then faded. When I moved down the hallway, outside the windows, I saw distant figures. A man in World War II uniform, a woman in a 1960s nurse cap, a little girl in a faded pinafore, all drifting quietly through half-lit doorways or sitting silently at footboards, repeating rituals learned in life and continued in death. Timothy never acknowledged seeing them, but I could swear he sometimes gave a subtle nod to empty chairs or waited for the old nurse's bell that rang once, obsolete for decades. One morning, he left a sock on a windowsill in 22C for Dora. There was no Dora on the official roster, but the name appeared in a long discarded admissions log dated 1941. I developed a practice of greeting every room, whether occupied or not, each morning. Good morning, room 29B. Good morning, Eleanor. Good morning, Charles. Sometimes the rooms felt lighter, sometimes heavier, depending on the day and who had gone or stayed. With each patient who passed, I'd offer a quiet blessing, watching for any small sign that they'd been received by their unseen companions. The living and the dead existed together, routines overlapping in timeless ritual. I began to understand what Marjorie meant. They're gentle, lonely. They just don't know it yet. Comfort came from acknowledging, from not denying the presence of those who lingered. The strangest part was how the manor kept accepting new residents, living or otherwise. Sometimes, in the early morning, as the mist rolled over the front lawn, I'd see figures walking the property lines, always toward the doors, never away. The staff learned to hear footfalls in empty wings and said thank you when night shift meals went untouched on trays. Even skeptical new nurses eventually made peace with doors that closed themselves and windows that suddenly fogged with shapes from the past. Hillview Manor was not a place where souls were trapped, but a place where they could continue routines, a last mercy for lives not entirely ready to slip away. When my contract ended, I hesitated to leave. Walking the halls one last time, I heard Marjorie's voice behind me. No need to fear, Mia. There's always someone ready to remember the rest. Driving away, I looked back at the building and in the windows saw shadows wave, not menacing, just present. Some faces familiar, some etched in time far before my first shift began. If you worked a job where the past and present overlap daily, would you choose to acknowledge everything you sensed, or shield yourself and pretend it's not real? Tell me your thoughts below. Thank you for watching Black Fears. If these true stories kept you thinking long after the video ended, leave a comment about which tale unsettled you most. Remember to like, subscribe, and share your own unexplained experiences. More chilling content is coming soon. Until next time, face your fears and never look away.